Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly fascinating set of source materials. We're looking at a very specific interpretation-based framework for understanding dinosaur paleontology and really the history of the Earth itself. Whenever we look at fossils, we're essentially looking at static evidence from the past. The bones don't speak. But how we understand that evidence, how we build the story around those bones, well, that depends heavily on the framework we use to look at them. This material offers a completely unique lens. It dives deep into how a creationist worldview interprets the exact same physical data that conventional science examines. It is just a fantastic exercise in understanding how our worldviews actually shape scientific interpretation, and I am so incredibly excited to guide you through this today. Here is the roadmap for our journey today. We've got 6 main stops. We'll start with dragons to dinosaurs, then reading the fossil record, the evolution debate, dinosaurs in scripture, the extinction question, and we'll wrap up with frameworks of interpretation. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Dragons to Dinosaurs, a History of Discovery. So, get this. Before the 1800s, people often used a completely different word to describe massive reptilian creatures: dragon. The source highlights that the English word dragon actually comes from the ancient Greek word drakon, which literally just translates to large reptile. The text points out that when ancient people used this word, they weren't necessarily talking about, the fire-breathing, winged mythical monsters we see in medieval fairy tales. Those super dramatic features, those were mostly artistic additions from much later traditions. Historically speaking, dragon was likely just a very literal, straightforward description of a very large, powerful reptile. Let's take a quick look at this timeline, because it shows just how surprisingly recent the scientific study of dinosaurs actually is. In 1676, Robert Plot found a massive bone, and his first guess was that it belonged to a Roman elephant. Then, moving to 1822, Gideon Mantell identifies a giant iguana-like tooth, which leads to the name iguanodon. But it wasn't until 1842 that anatomist Richard Owen officially coined the term dinosauria, which means terrible lizard. And get this, the very first mounted dinosaur skeleton, a Hadrosaurus, wasn't even displayed to the public until 1860. This timeline really illustrates how rapidly our whole framework for understanding these terrible lizards evolved in just a couple of centuries. Moving right along to Section 2, reading the fossil record, clues in the stone. One of the absolute best clues paleontologists have to work with is dental morphology, basically the shape of the teeth. The source breaks this down beautifully. On one hand, you have sharp, serrated teeth clearly designed for tearing flesh. Think of the famous T-Rex. But on the other hand, you have broad, flat teeth designed specifically for grinding up vegetation, like those of the iguanodon. The material emphasizes this to point out a really interesting fact. Despite their terrifying reputation, many of the absolute largest dinosaurs were actually just massive plant eaters. For a lot of them, their primary danger to others was literally just their enormous weight, not their bite. Now, here is where this framework views things a bit differently: the actual process of fossilization. We kind of tend to think of fossils as a normal, everyday occurrence, but the source notes that under normal conditions, a dead animal just decomposes or it gets scavenged. For a bone to actually turn into stone, it requires a perfect storm of highly specific conditions. We're talking rapid burial, absolute protection from scavengers, total shielding from oxygen and decay, and then eventual mineralization. So the source argues that when we find these massive scattered bone beds containing literally hundreds of disarticulated dinosaurs, it strongly points to a catastrophic event, specifically an event involving massive amounts of moving water and sediment that rapidly buried these animals all at once. Okay, the source material also brings up this incredible curveball of a discovery from back in 2005. Researchers were examining a T-Rex femur from Montana, and inside they found structures that actually appeared to be soft, flexible vessels right alongside shapes that strongly resembled red blood cells. The source highlights this to really challenge conventional assumptions about long-term decay. Because think about it, if delicate biological materials typically break down pretty quickly, finding flexible tissue in a fossil that is conventionally dated to 65 million years ago, well, within this specific interpretive framework, that raises some profound questions about the traditional millions of years timeline of Earth's history. All right, that brings us to Section 3, the evolution debate, transition or creation. To really grasp their argument here, we have to look at how the source defines two critical terms. First, microevolution. The text defines this as observable variation or adaptation within a specific kind of animal. Changes in size, beak shape, or fur color over time. The framework totally accepts this as observable fact. But then there's macroevolution.
This is defined as a large-scale transformation between fundamentally different body plans, like a reptile eventually turning into a bird. The source firmly disputes this macro-level change, arguing that the fossil record simply doesn't support those massive structural leaps.
A really famous example discussed in the text is the Archaeopteryx. Now, conventional models almost always present this as your classic transitional fossil, and you can see why. It has clear avian traits, fully formed feathers, wings capable of flight. But it also has distinct reptilian traits, like a jaw full of teeth, a bony tail, and clawed fingers on its wings. However, the source framework interprets this entirely differently. It points out that those feathers, they're fully formed and incredibly complex. They aren't half scales or frayed skin. So the text argues that this creature isn't some gradual transition caught in the middle of evolving. Rather, it's just a distinct, fully formed creature that simply has a unique combination of traits. And this brings us to a really powerful quote the source pulls from paleontologist David Weishampel. He states, "From my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. The source material leans heavily on this to underline its main argument. In the fossil record, dinosaur species seem to just appear abruptly, fully formed in the rock layers. They show up without the numerous gradual, intermediate, transitional species that a macroevolutionary model would totally expect to find leading up to them." Oh, and the material points out this totally fascinating irony in how dinosaurs are classified, just to highlight some of the complexities of evolutionary narratives. Basically, dinosaurs are fundamentally divided into two major groups based on their hip structure. You've got saurischian, which means lizard-hipped, and ornithischian, which means bird-hipped. The irony the source loves pointing out is that within evolutionary models, modern birds are actually theorized to have evolved from the lizard-hipped dinosaurs rather than the bird-hipped ones. It's a neat little detail the text uses to show that our structural naming conventions and our interpretive evolutionary conclusions don't always line up perfectly. Let's pivot now to Section 4, Dinosaurs in Scripture, a Biblical Lens. The source actually draws our attention to the book of Job, specifically chapter 40. This passage describes a massive plant-eating creature called the Behemoth. God describes this creature as having bones like bronze and just incredible sheer strength. Now, traditionally, some scholars have guessed this might be a hippopotamus, but the source zeroes right in on the phrase, "He moves his tail like a cedar." I mean, a cedar tree is massive. A tiny little spinning hippo tail doesn't exactly fit that majestic description, right? The source argues this ancient text might actually be a literal, eyewitness account of a long-tailed dinosaur. The text also makes this really interesting connection between the physical traits of dinosaurs and the narrative in Genesis 6. Genesis describes the world right before the global flood as a corrupted earth, utterly filled with violence. The source aligns this textual description with what we see in the fossil record. It notes that many dinosaurs, like the heavily armored Ankylosaurus or the spiked-tailed Stegosaurus, were built like absolute tanks for defense and combat. Within this creationist framework, this heavy armor isn't just viewed as an evolutionary arms race, it's seen as a direct reflection of a violently corrupted world where survival required extreme protection. Which leads us directly into Section 5, the extinction question, asteroid or flood. So let's say how this all builds into two distinct catastrophic theories presented in the text. First, you have the conventional asteroid impact theory. The idea here is that a massive meteor strikes the Earth, leaves behind a layer of rare iridium dust at the KT boundary, and causes a sudden, massive climate shift that wipes out the dinosaurs. Alternatively, the source presents the global flood theory, derived from Genesis. This model suggests massive tectonic upheaval, crazy volcanic activity, and massive continent-wide flooding. Impartially speaking, the source notes that a global flood would also dramatically alter the climate. It would cause the rapid, massive burials needed to create those fossil bone beds we talked about, and it would create an incredibly severe environmental challenge. The argument here is that the exact same physical evidence we dig out of the ground can be logically explained by this massive water-based catastrophe. Finally, we hit Section 6, Frameworks of Interpretation, Evidence versus Inference. If you take one thing away from our explainer today, it's this hard, fast distinction the source draws between what is directly observed and what is inferred. The observed evidence is completely static. It's the physical bones you can touch, it's the shape of the teeth, it's the footprints dried in the mud, the trace impressions of scales. We all agree those things exist. But the inferred conclusions, what color the dinosaur was, its exact evolutionary ancestor, or a timeline stretching back millions of years, those are models built around the data. The source argues that these inferences are inherently subjective, and they are heavily, heavily reliant on the pre-existing worldview of the person looking at the bone. And that brings us right to our final big picture thought. The source leaves us pondering this absolutely critical question. If our interpretation of the past depends so heavily on our concept of time, how does our chosen timeline shape our understanding of the exact same physical evidence? It's a really provocative reminder that data rarely, if ever, just speaks for itself. Whether you view these magnificent creatures through the lens of deep time and gradual evolutionary change, or through a framework of recent creation and a global catastrophe, your foundational worldview ultimately dictates the story you read in the stones. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked some deep curiosity for you about how we interpret the world beneath our feet.